Welcome everybody. Let me get my screen share going. Title obviously is The Antiquity of Irrigation in the Southwest. Before I start, I'd like to give some credits to some organizations that were instrumental in having me develop this presentation. First, Norm mentioned Arizona Humanities, which gave a grant for this program. I've been on the Speakers Bureau for Arizona Humanities for a long time, and occasionally they require us to do new presentations and not just the ones we've done before. So this is one of my new ones that I developed a couple of years ago through Arizona Humanities. Also, Old Pueblo Archaeology Center, as Norm mentioned, it's a Tucson nonprofit organization set up to do education and research programs in archaeology, cultures, and history. So I encourage you to go to their website and find out more about them. And certainly not least, even though it is third on my list here, the Cosanti Foundation for sponsoring this series. I really appreciate being a member of that elite group. I'm going to start out here in Arizona and partly in New Mexico, looking at the Gila River watershed, because this is where Antiquity, the irrigation in the Southwest, is the earliest place we found it archaeologically. Add a few cities so you can get more referenced along the Gila and some of its tributaries there. A lot of people think that the Hohokam culture that developed in south central Arizona, primarily in the Phoenix and Tucson areas, was the first culture to have practiced irrigation, and it indeed was an early culture to start irrigation works in Arizona. The red highlight here kind of shows the extent of the Hohokam culture area. The Hohokam developed in this area between about 400 or 500 CE, and the culture collapsed sometime in the mid-1400s. So a little bit about the Hohokam. It was an irrigation society, an agricultural society that arose around 400 or 500 CE, and they started irrigating in the Gila and Salt River valleys in the Phoenix area quite early. The Hohokam culture flourished for approximately 1,000 years before it collapsed, and a lot of the area was depopulated by the Hohokam after that cultural collapse, but not entirely in the Phoenix area. But were the Hohokam the first farmers and irrigators of ancient times? Well, to answer that question, I'd like to go pretty far back in time and take a little broader scope in the origins of agriculture in the Americas. The earliest known New World crops arose in Ecuador as early as about 9,000 BCE. For anybody unfamiliar with BCE and CE dates, BCE is the same as BC and CE is the same as AD. So I tend to use the BCE and CE dates. Earliest known crops were squash and bottle gourds and a minor root crop called Loren, which I show a picture of here, the third one over. We have archaeological evidence that squash was domesticated in Oaxaca between about 8,000 and 6,000 BCE. And before 5,000 BCE, the food production in Central America and adjacent regions involved simple horticulture focused on a number of plants, including maize, which became one of the most important plants in the Americas eventually. Beans originally were domesticated between about 7,000 and 5,000 BCE. There is some disagreement as to where they originated in the Americas. The kidney bean, and I give you the Latin name for it there, the ancestor of the kidney beans initially was thought to have originated in Mesoamerica, meaning southern Mexico and the Central America area, and to have spread out from there. The lima bean was thought to have originated in the highlands of southern Peru, so fairly far apart. More recent studies suggest that lima beans actually originated in Guatemala because there are multiple endemic forms of wild lima bean plants that grow there now. The earliest evidence of domesticated bean cultivation or utilization does come from Peru, where bean starches have been documented from archaeological excavations. Now, going back to maize, one of the most important crops in the Americas, for a long time it was suspected that maize had evolved from a wild grass called teosinte. And there was a lot of speculation about this because there are some similarities between these two species, but it wasn't until 1990 the genetic evidence actually proved that maize had been developed from this teosinte, a wild grass that has hard kernels. And I show a picture of the kernel spike over on the right. It's not on a cob, it's more on a spike compared to corn cobs. And the maize ear that I show here on the right just has 8 rows of corn. Most modern sweet corn has 12 to 16 rows. And this was bred using some early archaeological corn that was recovered from the Hohokam Valley in Mexico. So we believe this is what some of the earliest corn looked like, was this 8-row corn that you see here. Apparently people began using teosinte and planting its seeds with the seeds that had the most favorable traits between 10,000 and 13,000 years ago. And they transformed it over successive generations by continually replanting the best of the seed crop. So this was some of the first genetically modified organisms in the New World. We do see true corn in central Mexico archaeological sites dated as early as 7200 BCE. Now, once it was developed there, it spread gradually to both North and South America. It was cultivated widely from southern Mexico, mostly into northern South America. By about 4300 BCE, there were more modern-like varieties from the Central American lowlands to the highlands of Oaxaca. And the left arrow there shows the highlands of Oaxaca. Around 3500 BCE, maize was present in the semi-arid Hohokam Valley, which is near Pueblo, Mexico. And by about 2400 BCE, there was a sudden expansion of maize cultivation into both North and South America. Now you'll notice on the upper part of the map here, and this is from the Archaeologist Southwest organization, I'd like to give them credit for that. I have the dates 2100 BC, this is from their maps, BCE, 2100. And these are some of the earliest dates we have for the presence of corn in the southwestern United States. Those two dated sites are in Arizona and New Mexico. So we believe that maize was probably introduced into the American Southwest. It moved up from Mexico during this post-2400 BCE expansion period. Archaeologists thought for many years that maize had reached the Southwest through the Mexican highlands, but more recent studies indicate that it spread to the Southwest about 4,100 years ago, 2100 BCE, over a highland route, and another entry via a lowland coastal route occurred much later, around 2,000 years ago. So multiple means of entry into what's now the United States. Some other plants kind of important in southwestern pre-contact times. Pumpkins and other squashes were present in the Southwest as early as 300 BCE. They've been found in caves in New Mexico. Cotton was cultivated in southern Arizona since at least 600 CE, mostly in the Middle Gila River watershed. Later on up in the Hopi area. And eventually cotton was grown even in the northern Arizona area by these Hopi ancestors and other Pueblo peoples. Another important crop was agave, this very broadleaf succulent, kind of a desert spike leaf plant, which is useful both as a food source. The hearts of the agave are very nutritious, and the long leaves produce long fibers that are useful for making textiles. If you're familiar with burlap, burlap is made from agave fibers. So I've talked about the history of agriculture, and so that leads to the question, were agriculture and irrigation both introduced to the American Southwest from Mesoamerica? You would think that would be a logical conclusion. But the answer is apparently not. The oldest known Mesoamerican excuse me, water control features, which include dams, reservoirs, and ditches for runoff diversion and drainage, date between about 1200 and 800 BCE. This chart is from a book by geographer William Doolittle, Bill Doolittle, and the title is Canal Irrigation in Prehistoric Mexico, the Sequence of Technological Change. And this was published in 1990. So when I was putting this presentation together, I called Bill Doolittle and asked him, is this still the most current information in Mexico? Because it shows that the earliest water control features started at around 1200 BCE, this upper site, Teopantecuantitlan, pretty hard to pronounce, kind of like archaeology. And he told me, in fact, it was still current. This was as of about 4 or 5 years ago. So still, the earliest known irrigation features in Mexico date to about 1200 BCE. If we compare that, the earliest known canals, actual irrigation canals in the Gila watershed area are in the Tucson area in the Middle Santa Cruz Valley. And they've been dated to at least 1500 BCE. So at least 300 years prior to any known irrigation works in Mexico. The two sites where these early canal systems have been found so far in the Tucson area, one is called the Clearwater Archaeological Site, which has canals dated at 1500, 600, and 150 BCE, and another site called Las Capas, where canals have been dated at 1250 and 800 BCE. And I haven't been able to verify this yet, but I heard a report, a verbal report, that recently Archaeology Southwest, their desert archaeology group, had actually discovered some even earlier canals at Las Capas. And so I'm still waiting for the reports on that. But as of published information so far, the earliest ones we know of in the Southwest are at 1500 BCE, and that's still 300 years earlier than the earliest ones we know of in Mexico. So these differences in the introduction time of water control features suggest that irrigation technology was actually developed independently by what we call the early formative cultures in the United States. And all of this was within the Gila River watershed, and the earliest ones we've seen so far are actually in the Tucson area. The Santa Cruz River is a tributary of the Gila system. Now, the biotic context of early southwestern irrigation, most of it has been found in the Chihuahuan and Sonoran deserts. I've superimposed the Gila River drainage system on the map here, and you can see it's mostly in Arizona, but it extends a little bit into New Mexico, and the San Pedro and Santa Cruz rivers down here barely extend into Mexico on the international boundary side of the line. So the Chihuahuan desert scrub situation where irrigation developed is largely a grassy plain with a lot of low shrubbery and low cactus, like you see in this photograph. And much of the Sonoran Desert is where you find the taller cacti, and it's actually a very lush desert compared to virtually any other desert in the world. But it's also one of the hottest deserts in the world. Now, the Sonoran Desert especially was conducive to the development of irrigation for a couple of reasons. First of all, there are deep soils in this area. They are river-deposited silts, primarily deposited by the Gila River and the Salt River and some of their tributaries. So it's very rich in silts and sands and soil nutrients. One disadvantage of this area is that it has relatively low annual precipitation. It's only about 3 to 12 inches per year, about 8 to 30 centimeters. But a big advantage of growing crops in here, if you can irrigate them, is that there is a very long growing season. We have over 260 frost-free days per year in an average year. And normally you can bring a corn crop, a maize crop to production in about half that time. So there's even the potential for 2 crops per year in the Sonoran Desert. if you can get the water to your crops. Some of the Sonoran Desert farming types that developed, there were a number of farming strategies, but the primary ones were major irrigation systems. For example, archaeologists have identified more than 300 miles of canals, Hohokam Canals, just along the Salt River. And the Hohokam also developed rainfall and runoff capture systems using the floodwaters coming off the mountains, primarily during the summer monsoon rains, and they would channel that water out onto their fields. Now, we do have evidence that maize was actually present in the Southwest as early as 2200 BCE. That's the earliest date we know of now for the Southwest. And that irrigation features were in use as early as 1500 BCE. And as I mentioned, that date may be pushed back with some new information that's now coming out. So I'd like to show you some of the excavations that were done at Las Capas, this archaeological site in Tucson. It's actually in Marana, Arizona, which is just to the northwest of the Tucson metro area proper. This slide is an aerial view looking down at an excavated area of Las Capas. And all of these white lines, white outlines you see, are actually spray painted on the ground to outline the color differences of the soil. You can see the soil in these thin lines here is much lighter color than the soil in these larger, somewhat rectangular plots. And these are what archaeologists have identified as actual field plots. You know, these darker areas here, and they had berms built up around them to hold the water in. And in some cases, you have canals coming through in between some of the garden plot courses. So whenever they wanted to irrigate a particular plot, they could just knock down the berm a little bit, let the water flow in. And then when it was filled, they could build the berm back up again, you know, to keep the water in the canal and go into other fields. Just for scale, this photo, the little dot here with my lowest arrow is actually a person standing in this excavation area. And this kind of L-shaped area here was an experimental field plot that the desert archaeology folks put together while they were doing this excavation. It took them several months of excavation on this project during the spring and summer of 2009, I believe. And so they decided to see if they could grow corn crops in this area in the same kind of soils that, you know, pre-contact people had used. And it started out wonderfully successfully. They planted their corn, you know, they irrigated it, you know, artificially, of course. You know, they didn't have the prehistoric canals to do it with. But they started their corn crop, the corn came up, and after it had been up for a couple of weeks, they lost it all because the rabbits got to it. So it was a valiant effort. But in this excavation at Las Capas, they identified more than 15 acres of pre-contact fields. When I say pre-contact, I'm talking about pre-Spanish contact. So that would be before about the 1600s in this area. This is a map showing some of the archaeological features that were identified at Las Capas. The yellow outlines are the areas that were actually excavated by archaeologists, and the areas in between that were not excavated, the reason those were not explored is because they were doing this excavation project to plan for the expansion of a wastewater treatment plant that Pima County was going to build next to an existing plant. So all these areas in between the yellow boxes here already had structures on them, you know, modern structures. So this map shows some of the canals and structures that were identified in the Las Capas excavation. The dashed lines here are, if I can find my key here, what they call primary canals. The solid lines are what they call the lateral canals, the ones that came off of the primary canals and directly into the fields. So you can see there's several different excavation areas where they found these architectural or these agricultural features, and they also found structures. All these little red circles or ovals on the map are small housing areas where people lived in pit structures next to their fields. This is the same view but showing different archaeological features. These are some of the canals and field borders that you see, all these little green plots in here are the field areas like I showed you in the photo previously. So they found those in several of the excavation blocks that they did. They were able to extrapolate the directions of the canals from one block to the other just by the trajectory of the canals that they saw in each one. And they determined that the main canal down here on the lower right was actually derived from the Santa Cruz River. It's one of the places where the river tended to flow continually year-round. Now, in some of the later years, the Hohokam built on these systems that were developed by these early agricultural period people and really became masters of irrigation in the Sonoran Desert. So between about 450 and 1450, this is a Hohokam Canal that was excavated at the archaeological site of Snaketown, which is on the Gila River Indian Reservation just south of Phoenix. And the fellow standing in that canal there is Emil Howery. He's the one who headed up this project, pretty well-known archaeologist in the Southwest. And Emil Howery, I think, was about 6'6". That gives you an idea how big and deep these canals were. And the reason why it looks like there's two canals here is because in the archaeological excavation, they actually found two layers in this canal course. This upper layer was the later one, where the earlier canal that you see here in the foreground had actually silted in quite a bit. So they started irrigating at a higher level in that same canal course here at Snaketown. And that's often the way we find some of these prehistoric canals in archaeological excavations. This is a view of a Hohokam Canal in the Salt River Valley. Kind of a crude photo because I scanned it from a lithograph photograph in a book, so it's kind of grainy. But you can see from the tire tracks running down this is a pretty good sized canal. It has the embankments up on both sides here and a silted in area in the center. This is one of the earliest, or one of the biggest Hohokam canals that have been discovered. This is in Phoenix. It's one of the main canals that came off of the Salt River. It's called the Pueblo Grande North Canal, and it's in a place called the Park of Four Waters, which is a side area of the Pueblo Grande Museum and Cultural Center in Phoenix. It's located at Washington Street and 24th Street in East Phoenix. And this is a place you can visit. They only give tours to the Park of Four Waters like once a month, so you have to kind of get on their website to know when the schedule is for that. But the Pueblo Grande archaeological site itself is quite impressive, so that's worth a visit, and they have a wonderful museum there as well. The person standing in this canal, you can see the banks of the canal behind her over here to the left, and way over here to the right. That's how huge this canal is that came off the Salt River. And this is Lorene Montero, who is currently the city, Phoenix City archaeologist. This is a map showing some of the Hohokam Canal systems that were developed along the Gila River down here. And over here to the far left is where the Salt River joins the Gila. And you can see there's the tail end of some canal systems here and the tail end of some here coming off the Salt River. I'll show you a full map of that here in a minute. But there's also a set of Hohokam canals that were discovered in between those two rivers in the Queen Creek area of Arizona. And this was water that was taken off of Queen Creek, which you see here. It's a stream that never really quite makes it to the Gila River, but they were able to divert irrigation water off of this. So Hohokam were really masters of irrigation. This is a map that was put together in the 1920s by Omar Turner, who was the Phoenix city engineer. He was a hydrological engineer. And as a hydrologist, he was very interested in irrigation in general, so he became very interested in the Hohokam irrigation. So he took it upon himself to try to trace out as many of the Hohokam canals as possible while he was working for the city of Phoenix. So this was over several decades that he was the Phoenix city engineer. So this is a map that Omar Turner put together showing some of the main canal systems and some of the major Hohokam archaeological sites along these canal systems, just a wonderful work done in the 1920s. And that picture I showed you of the large canal with Lorraine Montero in the photo, that was the Pueblo Grande North Canal, this really long one here coming off the Salt River near Pueblo Grande. And on this map, it shows as being 22 miles long. And since this map was made, archaeologists have traced this canal out further. So it's now known to have extended at least 27 miles long out from the Salt River. It's pretty impressive. So this kind of shows those two views that I just showed you, the canals along the Gila and the larger rectangle here, and the very concentrated canals along the middle Salt River in the Phoenix area. This is a historical photo showing how historical tribes who lived on the Gila River, the Akimel A'adam, who are also known as Pima, every year they had to clean out their canals from all the silts that had accumulated previously. And they did this by using horses and Fresno scrapers to clean out the canals, and then they had to rebuild the weir out into the Gila River to divert the water. The prehistoric pre-contact people never actually dammed up either the Salt or the Gila River. You know, they were not quite capable of doing that. But instead, they built structures that we call weirs, extending out partly into the river by sinking poles and interweaving brush in between the poles to divert the flow just enough that it could get into the canals and move it onto their fields here. So pretty enterprising. And the Akimel A'adam continued this in the early 20th century before the dams were built on the upper Gila River. This is how wide the Gila used to flow, you know, pretty commonly before Coolidge Dam was built on the upper Gila. In some of the later Hohokam years also, the Hohokam culture expanded eastward into the Safford area, kind of on the eastern Hohokam periphery. So there have been canals found in the Safford area as well along the Gila. And those are kind of usually attributed to Hohokam influence on the cultures of that area, which are a little bit different from Hohokam. So between about 1300 and 1450, some major canals were known, and there were also a number of highly gridded fields. This is an example of a gridded agricultural field near Safford on the river terrace, and all these little grid patterns are made by the rocks being cleared from the fields to make these little square garden plots, just like I showed you at Las Capas, but this is much later in time. This particular set of fields was not fed by the Gila River Canal that was found earlier, but it was fed by another one. There are also some canals reported near Fort Thomas by Adolphe Bandelier, who came into this area in the 1880s. He was a cultural anthropologist who recorded a lot of the cultures, including archaeological sites, when he visited southern Arizona. And others have been found recently near Safford and in the San Carlos River Valley, which is now on the San Carlos Apache Reservation, just up from Coolidge Dam. There's another kind of canals that's been found in the Safford area that are called hanging canals or foothill canals. These are canals that are actually built along the hillsides, and they channel water from relatively permanent springs in the Mount Graham area, the Peñaleno Mountains, and they channel that water and bring it down to the floodplains below. So this picture on the left shows a clearly indicated hanging canal coming down slope off the side of the hill here. And the right photo is a close-up showing what one of them looks like when you walk down. It's like almost a road bed, but it's actually a hanging canal. These hanging canals are as much as 200 feet above the valley floor that they fed water to. And the people who have been studying these, which is Jim Neely and I can't remember the other fellow's name, but they've identified up to 37 miles of these hanging canals just in the Peñaleno Mountains, you know, flowing down towards the Gila. So this is also attributed to Hohokam influence. You know, the Hohokam were real masters of irrigation in the desert, and so their knowledge about this spread to some of the surrounding people. Um, Among these hanging canals, Neely and his colleagues did find at least one above-grade aqueduct associated with one of these canals. So this was a pretty neat engineering feat as well. Now, archaeologists who studied the few known Safford area canals do generally attribute them to Hohokam influence because, irrigation was developed earliest in the Hohokam area and actually earlier than the Hohokam themselves. Some of the large pre-contact village sites in the Safford area have what appear to be Hohokam ball courts. These are stadium-like features with built-up berms that were probably actually used for playing a ball game. And some of these have been found in the Safford area, so those are also attributed to the Hohokam, where these ball court features are very common. And a few years ago, we also identified another hanging canal in the Tucson-Marana area out near Red Rock. So that's the first one known outside of the Safford Valley. Now, if you go farther upstream in the Gila River drainage into the west, where it goes into New Mexico, the upper Gila and San Francisco River drainages, there are some traces of pre-contact canals in that area, but nothing really extensive. Probably the reason for that is when you get up into these upper Gila River areas, the gradient of the land becomes too steep to effectively control the water flow without it washing out the canals. In the Salt River Valley, in the main part of the valley where all those 300 miles of canals were, the gradient of the land, the elevation drop is about 1 foot per 1,000 feet. So it's a 0.1% gradient. In the Gila River, or in the upper Gila and on the Members Valley on the other side of the mountains there, the gradients are much steeper, so it's much harder to control water, at least for any lengthy canal. But some have been found in the lower Gila Valley, down near Deming, and in the Arenas Valley, which is just outside the Members Valley, near Silver City, it's just east of Silver City. It's been suggested that some of these canals in the Members and Arenas Valley area may have been fed by runoff from the surrounding slopes rather than from the Members River itself, which is the only major stream in that area, in addition to the upper Gila. Now, going the opposite direction to the west of the Hohokam, we get into the lower Gila and lower Colorado River areas. And the ancient culture that occupied this area from about 400 to 1450 is called the Patayan or Patayan culture. They're ancestors of the human-speaking language groups in those areas. And you would think that since the Hohokam had developed such extensive irrigation systems here along the middle Gila and Salt Rivers, that it would be even more extensive down here on the lower Gila and the lower Colorado. But in fact, that is not the case. And the reason for that is because the people in that area, although they were farmers, they didn't have to irrigate because of the natural characteristics of the river down in that area. The way they conducted agriculture is by a process that we call floodplain inundation farming. And this involves just letting the river flood every year, and you would get massive floods on the lower Gila and lower Colorado every year with the spring runoff. And each year when that happened, it would deposit a new layer of very nutritious silt, nutrient-laden silt, and it would keep the floodplains moist for almost all year long. So people didn't have to irrigate in that area. After the waters went down, they could just plant their corn in the floodplain, and there was enough moisture in the soil for the corn to come up to a full crop. So irrigation wasn't really necessary there. And in fact, we have not found any substantial irrigation, pre-contact irrigation systems in that area, although the irrigation is very well developed today for Anglo-American and Mexican-American farming. So I focused here mostly on Arizona and a little bit of western New Mexico and the upper Gila drainage. But what about the rest of New Mexico? New Mexico is part of the Southwest after all, so we should at least talk about it a little bit. So let me reorient here, get my map in order. We can focus on New Mexico a little bit. For a long time, it was assumed that all of the Puebloan people in the upper Rio Grande region, which is basically from about Socorro up through Albuquerque and Santa Fe up into way northern New Mexico, it was assumed that they engaged in extensive irrigation agriculture prior to the Coronado expedition of 1540, one of the first Spanish expeditions into this area. And some publications actually say that they found Pueblo people engaging in irrigation agriculture. Well, in fact, when you look at the evidence for that, neither of those assertions is accurate, and neither one is really founded on scientific or documentary evidence. The principal academic proponent of Puebloans as ancient irrigator was an archaeologist named Florence Ellis, who worked extensively in far northern New Mexico, and she frequently asserted that the Rio Grande Pueblos in that area acquired the idea and the technology of irrigation agriculture from the Chaco Canyon people. Well, Chaco Canyon is up here in northwestern New Mexico, kind of highlighted by the blue, Chaco Canyon at the center, but it had a very wide regional influence in the San Juan Basin of northwestern New Mexico. Chaco Canyon agriculture is known primarily from what we call the Great Pueblo periods, the Pueblo II and Pueblo III stages of development, from about 800 to 1100 CE. And the irrigation there relied heavily on water conservation and diversion features and not so much on irrigation features. So they spent a lot of effort developing contour terraces and check dams and some relatively simple irrigation canals. This is a diagram showing one of the more extensive irrigation systems in Chaco Canyon. They had a diversion dam crossing one of the washes that came into the canyon, and they had a canal that ran down to a head gate, and from there they fed some of these bordered gardens like I was showing you at Las Capas and in the Safford area. There's some of those in Chaco Canyon as well. This is a photograph of that irrigation system leading down to the fields. You can see it's relatively small. And as far as I've been able to tell, the only canals that the Chaco people had were fed entirely by storm runoff rather than by live streams. There's only one live stream in Chaco Canyon, and that's the Chaco River, and it's more of an arroyo than anything else today. We don't think it had too much water in it in pre-contact times either. So people really invested in extensive dams and minor canals, some ditches, head gates, and thousands of these earth-bordered gardens to trap the runoff water from the cliffs above Chaco Canyon. So Florence Ellis, the one who did a lot of the work in New Mexico, did identify some pre-contact water control features, and they were actually control features, not just conservation features, in northern New Mexico, one which was along El Rito Creek and the other in the Milwaukee Basin, just north of Santa Fe. So for many decades, these were the only irrigation systems known in New Mexico. The two that Florence Ellis identified, the ones in Chaco Canyon and the one in the lower Members Valley and the Arenas Valley near Silver City. Well, recently, some excavations by a nonprofit organization called the Hornada Research Institute have identified another well-dated pre-contact irrigation system in south central New Mexico. And this one is kind of exciting to me. I've actually visited with the archaeologist in charge of this and read some of his works and seen some of his presentations about this. This system was found next to a large archaeological village site called Creekside Village, and it's along Tularosa Creek, which comes out of the Sacramento Mountains, east of the San Pedro, east of the Rio Grande Valley. It's the next valley over. And one of the things they found in the excavation, this is a cross-section showing the terraces that people had built up that they actually irrigated with water from Tularosa Creek. So you can see there's multiple elevation stages level going down slope here. This is excavation test trench where you actually see the berms that they encountered in the test trench. Now, the irrigation water at this creekside village area was delivered to the terraced fields using a small ditch that branched into a series of shallow field ditches. And this is just a diagram how they think it may have worked. They don't actually have the actual remnants of all these little irrigation ditches here. That's probably how it worked. And they believe it was fed by a reservoir on the upstream end of it. The photograph here on the left shows a pretty typical what a canal looks like when you excavate it in a cross section. You'll get bedded layers of sand and silt and gravel that fill it up after it's abandoned. So you can see that here. The Creekside Village system, which, like I said, may have had a reservoir to feed the canal, has been pretty confidently dated to sometime between 650 and 850 CE. So this is now the earliest irrigation system known in New Mexico, and it's in southern New Mexico in the Chihuahuan Desert. So I have no doubt that there are many more discoveries to be made about early southwestern U.S. irrigation systems. And with that, I'd like to thank you all and leave it open to questions.